Okay, let's unpack this. For, well, decades now, the cornerstone of security over in Northeast Asia has rested on this really kind of terrifying promise. The U.S. nuclear umbrella is the ultimate security guarantee. You know, what the policy wonks call extended deterrence. America basically pledging its full nuclear might to defend key allies, Japan and South Korea specifically, even if it means, potentially, risking America's own survival.
And that promise, I mean, that core commitment, it's really being put to the test right now. We're seeing just unprecedented military modernization happening in Asia. So our mission today in this deep dive is to really get into the credibility of that commitment, because fundamentally, extended deterrence, it's a psychological game, isn't it? We need to dig into how these allies, these critical allies, actually perceive this guarantee and how the U.S. is trying to keep that resolve looking solid, especially when you've got these two big, modernizing, and frankly, very different threats staring you down. China is the long-term strategic competitor, and North Korea is this immediate nuclear-armed, unpredictable operational problem.
Yeah, the moment you said psychological game, that just hits the nail on the head. I think it was Thomas Schelling, right? The great strategic thinker. He described deterrence as the threat that leaves something to chance. The threat itself has to be scary enough to stop the enemy, but the promise behind it, that has to be believable enough to reassure your friends.
That tension, that's everything. Exactly. For this to work, the U.S. doesn't just need the hardware. I mean, the capability, the missiles, the bombers, that's obvious. What it really needs is absolute unquestionable resolve. And the huge challenge, especially when we talk about extended deterrence, is making your adversary believe, truly believe, that the United States is willing to risk, say, Honolulu getting hit in retaliation for defending an ally thousands of miles away.
Okay, so let's dig into that. Resolve and credibility. We know the U.S. has the arsenal, thousands of warheads. Capability, not really in doubt. But resolve, that willingness to actually, trade San Francisco for Seoul or L.A. for Tokyo, that's where it gets sticky, isn't it? How do allies even begin to deal with that fundamental fear?
Well, it puts them in this state of constant uncertainty, really. You can trace this fear all the way back to the Cold War. I mean, the question that always hung over European capitals was, would the U.S. really start a nuclear war with the Soviets to save Berlin or Paris, knowing full well it would likely mean Soviet missiles hitting American cities? When the defender's own survival is on the line, that promise to protect an ally, no matter how ironclad the treaty language looks in peacetime, it's always going to be questioned. Always.
Right, and this inherent doubt, this uncertainty, that breeds this core anxiety among allies, the thing we call decoupling.
Precisely. Decoupling. It's that deep-seated existential fear that when push really comes to shove, in a major crisis, Washington might blink, might hesitate, or just outright refuse to honor the commitment because the fear of Chinese or North Korean nuclear retaliation is too great. And that fear, it eats away at the alliance. It suggests there's a difference, a difference in how the U.S. values its own security versus an ally's. Primary deterrence for itself, but maybe not quite the same for extended deterrence. The Nixon doctrine back in the 70s, when Nixon kind of hinted allies should handle more of their own defense, that sent huge waves of decoupling fear through both Seoul and Tokyo. It has a history.
What's really fascinating, though, is how the nuclear stalemate itself, the whole MAD concept, mutually assured destruction, the idea that all-out nuclear war is just unthinkable, it doesn't actually create total peace. Instead, it almost seems like it gives, more aggressive players a bit of a license to operate just below that nuclear tripwire.
Ah, yes. The famous or infamous stability-instability paradox. It's a core concept here. When strategic nuclear war is so catastrophic that both sides know it's mutual suicide, it actually creates a weird kind of stability at the very highest level of conflict. Total war becomes almost impossible. But, and this is the crucial part, that stability at the top might actually embolden rivals to be more aggressive at lower levels. Why? Because they calculate, probably correctly, that the big power, the U.S. in this case, will be incredibly reluctant, loath to escalate, as the jargon goes, the conflict up to the nuclear level, because the ultimate consequences are just too horrifying.
Can you give a real-world example of how that plays out?
North Korea. It's the absolute textbook case. Look, the U.S. strategic nuclear deterrent, it definitely prevents Pyongyang from trying a full-scale invasion of South Korea. That's the high-level stability working. But it also ties the hands of the U.S. and South Korea when it comes to responding forcefully to lower-level provocations. Remember, 2010, the sinking of the South Korean warship, the Cheonan, or the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island. I mean, these were serious acts of aggression, acts of war, really. But the U.S. response, it was measured, carefully calibrated. They avoided massive retaliation. Why? Because massive retaliation might force North Korea to escalate rapidly, maybe even unpredictably. And that's exactly the bet Pyongyang makes, that the U.S. will prioritize avoiding that escalation ladder over delivering truly punishing consequences for their quote-unquote minor aggressions.
And we also need to keep in mind that showing resolve looks very different in peacetime compared to when a crisis is actually brewing.
Oh, absolutely a critical distinction. We talk about general deterrence versus immediate deterrence. General deterrence is your everyday state. It's peacetime. It's relatively cheap and easy for the U.S. to put out statements saying, Japan and South Korea are under our nuclear umbrella. Doesn't cost much. The real test, the painful, high-stakes test of credibility, that comes when things shift to immediate deterrence. That's when a crisis is blowing up. An attack looks possible, even likely, and the president, the decision maker, is forced to really weigh the potential cost of escalation against that commitment to the ally. That's when you see the U.S. start doing things like flying B-52 bombers over the Korean peninsula or sending a carrier strike group. Highly visible signals. It's about showing the enemy, okay, the risk is real now.
Okay, so if credibility is this constant struggle, let's pivot to the specific threats that are really driving this whole dynamic today. We've got China and we've got North Korea. Two very different problems, but both seriously challenging that U.S. umbrella.
Yeah, two very different beasts. Let's start with China. The transformation of the Chinese military, it's just staggering. Fueled by decades of incredible economic growth. They've had sustained, often double-digit increases in defense spending for, the last 15, maybe 20 years, and often without the kind of budget transparency we expect in the West. And this huge investment, it's been laser focused on modernizing the PLA Navy, the Air Force PLAAF, and critically for this discussion, their strategic nuclear forces. Japan especially watches this build up, particularly the lack of transparency around it, with real alarm. They worry that China's endgame is regional dominance, pushing the U.S. out.
And it feels like a lot of this modernization, especially after the U.S. sailed carriers through the Taiwan Strait back in '96, seems specifically aimed at keeping the U.S. Navy, further away, keeping them out of China's backyard.
That's the core of their military strategy, absolutely. It's called A2AD, anti-accessoria denial. After 1996, when those two U.S. carrier groups just sailed right in, basically unchallenged, Beijing realized that they needed to change the game. They doubled down on making it incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible, for U.S. surface ships, especially aircraft carriers, to operate safely anywhere near China's coast. They want to push that U.S. operating radius further and further out, extend China's own defensive bubble, you could say. It's about creating a credible keep-out zone to seriously complicate any U.S. thoughts of intervening, say, over Taiwan or maybe the Senkakus.
And the weapon system that always comes up in this context, the carrier killer.
Ugh, the DF-21D, yes. It's become almost mythical, hasn't it? It's a solid fuel, anti-ship ballistic missile. The nickname carrier killer stuck. It's got impressive range, maybe 1,500 kilometers. What makes it special, or at least theoretically special, is the maneuverable warhead. It's designed to be guided in its final phase, using data from a whole network of sensor satellites, over-the-horizon radar, you name it. The idea is it can adjust course to hit a moving target, like a carrier. Now, how well it actually works against a maneuvering carrier battle group under wartime conditions, that's still debated. But the threat of it forces U.S. carriers to operate much further out, hundreds of miles further back. And that severely limits their effectiveness, how many planes they can launch, how quickly.
But the threat isn't just about pushing U.S. ships back. China's also boosting its ability to hit the U.S. homeland directly, right? Eroding that sense of safety America used to have behind two big oceans.
That's the other major piece, the strategic shift. They're moving away from older, silo-based ICBMs like the liquid fuel DF-5, though some still exist. The focus now is on survivable road mobile systems, things that are harder to find and target. The big one everyone's watching is the DF-41, solid fuel, road mobile ICBM, ranged to cover the entire continental U.S. And the really key part, it's almost certainly MRV.
MRV.
Multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. Basically, one missile carries multiple nuclear warheads, each capable of hitting a different target. Why is that a big deal? Because it makes overwhelming missile defenses much easier. It's a cornerstone of ensuring their deterrent can survive a first strike and still hit back. That's central to their minimum deterrence idea. Yeah. And we're also seeing development of really advanced, almost exotic stuff, like the DFZF, that hypersonic glide vehicle. Travels incredibly fast, Mach 5+, and maneuvers. Makes it exceptionally hard for current missile defenses to intercept.
And it's not just the strategic stuff. The conventional gap between China and, say, U.S. allies, or even the U.S. itself, that's narrowing fast too.
Undeniably. The Chinese Air Force, the PLAAF, they're rapidly moving beyond older Soviet-era designs. They're fielding modern fourth-gen, even some fifth-generation fighters now, comparable in many ways to Western planes. Their ability to manage complex air operations, electronic warfare, ISR, it's improving dramatically. And the plan, the Navy, it's unrecognizable from what it was 20 years ago. It's gone from a coastal defense force to a genuine blue-water Navy. Modern destroyers, frigates, amphibious ships, and critically, new Jin-class ballistic missile submarines, the SSBNs carrying the JL-2 missile. That gives them a much more survivable sea-based leg for their nuclear deterrent, a secure second strike.
So amidst all this buildup, let's talk about their nuclear doctrine.
Hmm.
Officially, China sticks to this idea of minimum deterrence. But with all this new hardware coming online, how solid is that? How credible?
Right. Officially, China's posture is minimum deterrence, meaning they aim to keep the smallest nuclear arsenal they think they need. Current public estimates are usually somewhere between, say, 200 and maybe 300 warheads, though that's debated and likely growing. The goal isn't parity with the US or Russia. It's just having enough survivable weapons to guarantee they can inflict absolutely unacceptable damage on any attacker, even after absorbing a first strike. Assured retaliation, basically.
And they're unique among the big nuclear powers in having a formal no first use NFU policy, right?
That's correct. China is the only one of the original 5 nuclear weapon states under the NPT to have a declared unconditional no first use pledge. They also give what are called negative security assurances, promising not to use nukes against non-nuclear states. Their defense white papers consistently reaffirm this. However, and this is a big however, there's a lot of skepticism, especially in military and intelligence circles outside China. There's evidence of ongoing internal debate within the PLA itself about the conditionality of NFU. Some Chinese strategists have written, sometimes subtly, sometimes less so, that the NFU pledge might not apply if China's fundamental sovereignty, think Taiwan, for instance, or the very survival of the Communist Party regime, was threatened by a massive conventional attack. So there's this strategic ambiguity. Is it truly unconditional, or are there unstated exceptions? Because of that ambiguity, U.S. planners, and certainly planners in Tokyo and Seoul, they can't afford to take the NFU policy completely at face value. They have to plan for the possibility, however remote, that China might consider first use in extreme circumstances.
Okay, shifting gears now, because here's where it gets really interesting, maybe even more immediately worrying for the Allies. North Korea. This presents a totally different kind of challenge, doesn't it? A high-risk, immediate, asymmetric problem. China's about long-term competition, maybe regional dominance. Pyongyang seems focused almost entirely on just surviving and using its nukes as a shield and a bargaining chip against forces that are, conventionally at least, way stronger.
Exactly. And the speed of their progress, particularly on the nuclear and missile fronts, has frankly defied most predictions over the years. They've conducted, 6 nuclear tests now? Between 2006 and 2017. That last test in 2017 was significantly larger, potentially indicating a thermonuclear device, though there's debate. It showed undeniable progress. Arsenal size estimates vary wildly, as you'd expect with such a closed-off state. But most analysts put it somewhere between, say, 20 and maybe 60 nuclear weapons. And they've pursued 2 paths to get fissile material: plutonium from their Yongbyon reactor and highly enriched uranium from undeclared facilities.
But the really crucial step, the one that makes the threat much more tangible, is getting those warheads small enough to fit on missiles. Miniaturization. Where do analysts think they are on that?
That's the game changer, isn't it? Turning a bomb into a deliverable weapon. And the consensus among most intelligence agencies now, based on test yields, missile tests, and other indicators, is that North Korea has likely achieved miniaturization. They can probably mount a viable nuclear warhead onto at least some of their ballistic missiles. That makes their deterrent much more credible, much more dangerous.
So how does that miniaturized warhead translate into a direct threat for U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea? What are the delivery systems we worry about most?
Well, for threatening Japan and U.S. bases further out like Okinawa or even Guam, the main concern is their arsenal of Nodong MRBM's medium-range ballistic missiles. They're estimated to have maybe 150, 200 of these. Liquid-fueled mobile launchers. Range is about 1,200 to 1,500 kilometers. That puts all of Japan easily within reach. And the flight time, it's incredibly short, maybe 7 to 10 minutes from launch to impact. That gives very, very little warning time, drastically compressing the decision cycle for missile defense crews and political leaders in Tokyo and Seoul.
But for South Korea, especially Seoul, the threat isn't just missiles, right? It's that overwhelming conventional firepower parked right across the DMZ.
Oh, absolutely. That remains the nightmare scenario hanging over Seoul. North Korea has amassed just a staggering amount of artillery right near the border. We're talking thousands and over 8,500 artillery pieces, both towed and self-propelled, and over 5,000 multiple rocket launchers, MRLs, including newer, longer-range 300 millimeter systems. A lot of this is dug into hardened underground sites, HAPs, making them very difficult to take out preemptively. And the sheer volume means they could unleash a devastating barrage on the Seoul metropolitan area where almost half of South Korea's population lives in the opening minutes or hours of a conflict. It's a massive coercive threat, even without considering WMDs.
You mentioned WMDs. Beyond the nuclear program, what about chemical and biological weapons?
That's another huge layer to the threat. North Korea is widely believed to possess the world's third largest stockpile of chemical weapons. Estimates run from 2,500 up to 5,000 tons. This includes nasty stuff, like VX nerve agent, which they demonstrated they could deploy abroad in the assassination of Kim Jong-nam in 2017. And these agents could potentially be delivered by artillery shells, rockets, ballistic missiles, even unconventional means. They also have a long-standing biological weapons program. Intelligence suggests they've likely weaponized agents like anthrax, maybe smallpox, botulism. So when the U.S. talks about extended deterrence for South Korea, it has to cover this whole spectrum of WMD threats, not just nuclear.
Okay, and finally, we have to touch on the question that always comes up with North Korea, the rationality factor. You hear leaders like Kim Jong-un called unpredictable, irrational. If that's true, how on earth do you deter someone like that?
Yeah, it's constant debate, isn't it? The rhetoric out of Pyongyang is often so extreme, the brinkmanship so risky, that it's tempting to label the leadership as simply irrational, maybe like a madman who doesn't care about consequences. And if a leader truly doesn't value the survival of their own country or regime, then deterrence theory kind of breaks down. You can't deter someone who welcomes destruction. However, the dominant view within most governments and intelligence communities is that despite the crazy rhetoric, the Kim regime is rational in its own way. Its primary overriding goal is regime survival. Every provocation, every missile test, every nuclear development is ultimately aimed at ensuring the Kim dynasty stays in power and deterring external intervention, particularly from the U.S. So deterrence is still relevant, but it has to be tailored. You have to understand what they value most, which is the regime's continuation, its control over the country. It's not necessarily about popular welfare or economic prosperity in the way we might think. Deterrence works, but you need the right pressure points.
Right. So we have these two very different threats and two key allies, Japan and South Korea, living under the same U.S. nuclear umbrella, but clearly facing different strategic realities, different geographies, different economic pressures. How does that shared security promise actually play out differently in Tokyo versus Seoul?
The difference is really quite stark. It comes down to geography, history, and economics. Let's take Japan's view first. For Tokyo, there's a certain strategic clarity, maybe a grim clarity. They tend to see China as the major long-term, almost existential strategic challenge. That's driven by China's naval growth, its perceived lack of transparency, its assertiveness in the East China Sea, especially around the Senkaku Islands. North Korea, for Japan, is the immediate operational threat, the missile flying overhead, the potential attack today. So what Tokyo primarily wants from the U.S. umbrella is a credible backstop against Chinese nuclear coercion or political blackmail. They need that U.S. presence to counterbalance the regional heavyweight.
Okay, but South Korea, their situation seems way more complicated. They're caught in a much tougher balancing act, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. South Korea's view is deeply constrained by its geography and its economy. Economically, China is just indispensable. It's the ROK's largest trading partner by a huge margin, bigger than the U.S. and Japan combined. That makes Seoul incredibly vulnerable to Chinese economic pressure, as we saw clearly during the Thead dispute. Diplomatically, South Korea also desperately needs Beijing's cooperation, or at least its acquiescence, to manage the North Korean threat. They need China to restrain Pyongyang, even though they're often frustrated by Beijing's reluctance to apply real pressure. So while Seoul certainly shares concerns about China's military rise and regional ambitions, the dominant fear, the thing you hear constantly in South Korean strategic circles, is the fear of being caught in the middle. Caught between their indispensable security ally, the U.S., and their indispensable economic partner, China. They worry about being forced to choose sides in a worsening U.S.-China rivalry.
Now, it's not just external threats that shake Allied confidence. Sometimes U.S. policy shifts themselves create ripples, cause concern. We saw that with the Obama administration's push to reduce the role of nuclear weapons back in 2010.
Yes, the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, the NPR, that definitely caused some significant anxiety among allies, particularly Japan and South Korea, even as many arms control experts praised its direction. President Obama wanted to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons, reduce the stockpile, which led to the New START treaty with Russia, and importantly, he floated the aspiration of moving towards a sole purpose declaration for U.S. nuclear weapons.
Sole purpose, meaning nukes would only be used to deter or respond to a nuclear attack, not other kinds of attacks.
Yeah.
Why did that specific idea, even as an aspiration, worry Tokyo and Seoul so much?
Because it struck right at the heart of the umbrella's credibility against North Korea's most likely threats. Allies, especially South Korea, argued very strongly that narrowing the stated purpose of U.S. nukes would effectively decouple the U.S. response from a potentially devastating North Korean attack using chemical or biological weapons, or even a massive conventional attack aimed at overwhelming the South. They felt it was absolutely vital for the U.S. to retain the option, even if never used, of responding with nuclear weapons to a catastrophic, non-nuclear WMD attack. They needed that ambiguity. In the end, the 2010 NPR didn't formally adopt sole purpose. It kept some ambiguity, talking about use only in extreme circumstances to protect vital interests. But the fact that sole purpose was even seriously discussed was seen by many in Tokyo and Seoul as a sign that Washington might be looking for ways to limit its nuclear commitments, weakening the deterrent.
And if subtle policy debates caused ripples, the political rhetoric during the 2016 U.S. election cycle, well, that seemed to cause a tidal wave of anxiety in Asia.
Oh, 2016 was a shock to the system, a profound shock. Because the comments made during the campaign, particularly by Donald Trump, questioned the very foundations of the alliances. When he suggested that maybe Japan and South Korea should get their own nuclear weapons and complained constantly about the costs of keeping U.S. troops stationed there, questioning the value of the alliances, that wasn't just policy debate. That caused genuine panic in Seoul and Tokyo. The fear wasn't just about the words themselves. It was the worry that these comments reflected a deeper underlying sentiment in parts of Washington, a view of alliances as purely transactional, something the U.S. might walk away from if the price wasn't right. That kind of talk reinforced those deep-seated decoupling fears far more intensely than any nuanced discussion about nuclear posture reviews ever could. It hit a raw nerve.
Okay, so it's clear the Allies aren't just, sitting back passively and hoping the U.S. stays committed. They're actively involved, trying to shore up the credibility of the umbrella themselves through their own actions, their own defense policies, and intense dialogue with Washington.
Absolutely. They're not passive recipients. They are actively working to strengthen the guarantee.
Let's look at Japan first. They had this interesting dynamic, the public nuclear allergy, but also this sort of background strategic thinking.
Right. Japan operates under this powerful public norm, the three non-nuclear principles: no possessing, no producing, and no introducing nuclear weapons onto Japanese territory. That last one has always been a bit fuzzy, especially regarding U.S. Navy port calls. But the first two are firm public policy rooted in the unique trauma of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But behind the scenes, conservative political leaders and defense planners in Japan have always maintained what you might call a strategic insurance policy or a nuclear hedge.
The nuclear hedge, how does that actually work? What gives them that capability?
It comes from Japan's highly advanced and very extensive civilian nuclear power program. They have tons of technical expertise, advanced facilities, and crucially, large stockpiles of plutonium from reprocessing spent fuel, though much of it is stored abroad now under international agreements. This existing infrastructure gives Japan what analysts call a breakout capability. Should the U.S. alliance completely collapse or the nuclear umbrella utterly fail in a crisis, the assessment is that Japan could probably develop and assemble its own basic nuclear weapon relatively quickly. Estimates vary, but maybe somewhere between 6 months to a year or two. They don't want to do it. The political hurdles would be immense, but the latent capability is there. And that capability itself provides a degree of leverage in discussions with Washington. It ensures the U.S. takes Japan's security seriously because the alternative, a nuclear-armed Japan, is something the U.S. desperately wants to avoid.
So beyond that latent capability, how do they actively work with the U.S. day-to-day to make the current umbrella feel more solid?
The most important mechanism is dialogue. Deep consultation. The key forum here is the Extended Deterrence Dialogue, EDD. It was set up back in 2009. Think of it as a specialized, high-level working group, kind of like NATO's nuclear planning group, but tailored for the U.S.-Japan alliance. Its whole purpose is to give Japanese officials' defense, foreign ministry, real insight into U.S. nuclear planning, targeting philosophy, command and control, how decisions would actually be made in a crisis. Japan isn't necessarily asking to see, the specific target list for North Korea, but they need to understand the process, the thinking, the seriousness of the commitment. The EDD builds that trust and transparency. It provides crucial operational reassurance.
And on the military hardware side, Japan's moved away from a purely defensive posture to something more active.
Yes, exactly. They've shifted their defense concept from what used to be called basic defense force, essentially focused on repelling a direct invasion, to a dynamic defense force, or more recently, dynamic joint defense force. This isn't just rhetoric. It reflects a real shift towards building capabilities that allow Japan to be more proactive, more flexible, able to respond to threats further from its shores, and work more seamlessly with U.S. forces. This involves things like building up their amphibious capabilities, improving long-range surveillance, investing heavily in advanced fighters like the F-35, and, maybe most visibly, Japan has been an incredibly enthusiastic partner in developing and deploying ballistic missile defense (BMD) systems. They've poured billions into Aegis destroyers equipped for BMD, land-based PAX-3 interceptors. Primarily aimed at North Korea, but China, of course, views these BMD deployments with suspicion, seeing them as potentially undermining their deterrent.
There's also been more talk recently, sometimes quite open, about Japan potentially acquiring its own conventional strike capabilities,
Right.
maybe hitting missile launch sites preemptively. Where does that stand?
It's a recurring debate and a sensitive one. Legally, Japan has long interpreted its constitution, specifically Article 9, as not prohibiting preemptive strikes if they are deemed the absolute minimum necessary means of self-defense against an imminent attack. A prime minister said as much way back in the 1950s regarding missile bases. However, for decades, Japan deliberately chose not to acquire the actual hardware for offensive strikes, things like long-range cruise missiles or bombers. They relied on the U.S., the spear, while Japan focused on being the shield. Now, with the worsening threat environment, especially from North Korea, there's growing pressure within Japan, particularly on the conservative side, to develop its own counterstrike capabilities. They're looking at longer-range missiles. The strategic calculation is tricky, though. While having its own strike option seems logical for self-defense, some in Japan worry that if they build up too much offensive power, the U.S. might see it as a sign that Japan doesn't need the American spear quite as much anymore. Ironically, it could feed into the very decoupling fears they're trying to counter. It's a delicate balance.
Okay, let's contrast that with South Korea. Given they live literally right next door to the immediate threat, their approach to reassurance seems much more focused on tangible, visible signs of U.S. commitment.
That's definitely true. That need for visible, concrete reassurance has deep historical roots in South Korea. You have to remember the context. After the Nixon Doctrine in the early 70s signaled a potential U.S. pullback from Asia, South Korean President Park Chung-hee felt abandoned and secretly launched his own nuclear weapons program. Washington found out, put immense pressure on Seoul to stop, but also realized they needed to offer something concrete. So, in 1975, the Ford administration took the unusual step of formally acknowledging, essentially confirming, the presence of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons deployed on the Korean peninsula. That was done explicitly to reassure Seoul and convince Park to abandon his indigenous program. Those U.S. nukes stayed until the early 90s. So that history created a lasting expectation in Seoul for tangible, demonstrable signs of the U.S. commitment.
And how does that play out today? What are those visible signals South Korea pushes for?
It often takes the form of very public requests for and announcements of rotational deployments of U.S. strategic assets onto or near the Korean peninsula. We're talking about things like B-52 or B-2 stealth bomber flyovers, port calls by nuclear-powered submarines, or deployments of entire aircraft carrier strike groups to Korean waters. Seoul really ramps up the pressure for these kinds of deployments during periods of high tension, like after a North Korean nuclear test or major missile launch in 2013, 2016, 2017. They initially pushed for a permanent redeployment of tactical nukes, but Washington resisted that. So they settled for agreements on regular, high-profile rotational deployments. For the South Korean public, and frankly for their military leadership too, seeing those bombers overhead or that carrier group nearby is powerful, visible proof that the U.S. guarantee isn't just words on paper. It's real. It's immediate.
And like Japan, they also have these deep consultative bodies with the U.S., right? But maybe focus more squarely on the North Korean problem.
Yes, they do. They established the Deterrence Strategy Committee, DSC, which brings together high-level defense officials from both sides. And building on that, they jointly developed what's called the Tailored Deterrence Strategy, TDS. The TDS is crucial because it's specifically designed to plan responses across the entire spectrum of potential North Korean provocations and attacks, not just nuclear, but conventional, chemical, biological, cyber, everything. It's about tailoring the deterrent threat to the specific nature of North Korea's asymmetric capabilities. These mechanisms ensure that South Korean planners are deeply integrated with U.S. counterparts. They understand the war plans. They know how U.S. strategic forces would actually be used in different scenarios. It builds confidence and interoperability.
South Korea also managed to get the U.S. to relax restrictions on its own missile capabilities, allowing them to develop missiles that can reach anywhere in North Korea. That seems like a pretty big deal, giving them their own conventional punch.
It was a major, hard-won achievement for Seoul, requiring years of sensitive negotiations with Washington. Back in 2012, they secured a key revision to the bilateral missile guidelines, which had previously limited the range and payload of South Korean ballistic missiles. The revision significantly increased the permitted range, eventually up to 800 kilometers for ballistic missiles, with payload limits also eased. Why is 800 kilometers the magic number? Because it ensures that South Korean missiles, like their Hyunmoo series, can reliably strike targets anywhere in North Korea, even in the farthest northern regions near the Chinese border, where key leadership bunkers and missile bases are thought to be located. This gives Seoul its own credible, conventional counterstrike capability. It's part of what they call their kill chain and Korea massive punishment and retaliation, KMPR concepts. Having this capability means Seoul isn't solely reliant on the U.S. for strike options in response to lower-level provocations. It gives them more agency and arguably reduces the immediate pressure on the U.S. to escalate in a crisis.
And finally, when we talk about South Korea shoring up its defenses, we absolutely have to mention the huge political and economic fallout over the THAAD missile defense system.
THAAD, yes. The deployment of that single U.S. terminal high-altitude area defense battery became this massive flashpoint, primarily in South Korea's relationship with China. Initially, Seoul was very hesitant to accept THAAD precisely because they anticipated furious opposition from Beijing. China saw THAAD's powerful radar as potentially looking deep into Chinese territory, undermining their own missile forces, even though the U.S. and LOC insisted it was purely defensive and aimed only at North Korea. The Chinese ambassador in Seoul even publicly warned, quite undiplomatically, that deploying THAAD could destroy bilateral relations in an instant. But then came North Korea's fourth nuclear test in January 2016, followed by a long-range rocket launch. When China seemed unwilling or unable to really rein in Pyongyang after those provocations, the security calculus in Seoul shifted decisively. The direct threat from North Korea began to outweigh the fear of Chinese retaliation. So despite incredibly harsh, unofficial economic sanctions from Beijing targeting South Korean tourism, entertainment exports, retail companies like Lotte that provided the land for THAAD to South Korea pushed ahead and formally agreed to deploy the system later in 2016. It was a clear case where immediate security imperatives overrode massive economic pain.
Okay, so the U.S. has the weapons, the capabilities there. The allies are working hard through dialogue and their own defenses to make the reassurance side feel solid. But underpinning this whole thing is the credibility of actual use. What are the really powerful forces, the deep constraints that make pulling the nuclear trigger so incredibly unlikely, almost unthinkable?
Right, this is the crux of it. The constraints are immense. They operate on multiple levels: normative, moral, strategic, military. Probably the most powerful overarching constraint is what scholars call the nuclear taboo. This is the strong, widely shared international norm against the use of nuclear weapons that has taken root since 1945. It's held for over 75 years. This isn't just, a feel-good aspiration. It's a deeply internalized constraint that shapes how leaders think, how militaries plan, how publics react. Any U.S. president knows that being the first to break that taboo, even against an adversary using WMDs, would incur catastrophic international political costs. It would shatter America's moral standing, isolate the U.S. globally, and almost certainly trigger runaway nuclear proliferation elsewhere. The normative barrier is incredibly high.
So even if purely military logic in a desperate crisis might point towards using a low-yield nuke, the global political fallout, the breaking of the taboo, is just too costly.
For the most part, yes. And then you layer on the direct military and strategic constraints. The biggest fear, always, is uncontrollable escalation. Once you cross that threshold from conventional to nuclear war, no one knows where it stops. The risk of things spiraling completely out of control, potentially leading all the way up to strategic exchanges that could destroy the U.S. itself, is ever present. Leaders are acutely aware of that slippery slope. Plus, even thinking about using tactical, lower-yield nuclear weapons on a battlefield, say in Korea, it creates huge operational problems. You've got radioactive contamination to worry about. That complicates things for your own troops who might need to operate in the area afterwards. And the risk of fallout drifting onto allied civilian populations in South Korea or Japan, it's politically radioactive, literally and figuratively.
Let's apply those constraints to our two specific threats. Start with North Korea. That's maybe the scenario where you could most easily imagine some kind of nuclear use happening, right?
Perhaps. It's certainly easier to conceive of a scenario involving North Korea than one involving China. But even here, the constraints are powerful. Let's imagine the worst case. North Korea conducts a nuclear first use, maybe against a U.S. military base in the region, or even, God forbid, a South Korean city. Would the U.S. automatically respond with nuclear weapons? Probably not. Why? Because the calculation would likely be that overwhelming U.S. and South Korean conventional military power would be sufficient to achieve the primary war aim, which would almost certainly be the complete destruction of the Kim regime without needing to resort to nuclear weapons ourselves. Using nukes in response would achieve little militarily that conventional forces couldn't, but it would incur all those catastrophic political and normative costs we just talked about, plus the risk of further North Korean nuclear retaliation if they had surviving weapons. So, even in response to DPRK first use, the pressure to stick to conventional means would be immense. U.S. nuclear use is really reserved for only the most truly existential threats to the U.S. or potentially its allies' survival.
Okay. And against China, with its own secure nuclear deterrent, nuclear use seems almost off the table entirely.
It's incredibly remote, almost unimaginable outside of a truly catastrophic civilization-ending scenario. Any plausible conflict between the U.S. and China, say, over Taiwan, or maybe clashes in the South China Sea, would almost certainly be kept regional and conventional by both sides. Neither side has any interest in escalating to the nuclear level. The U.S. goal would be to deter Chinese aggression or defeat it regionally, not to threaten the Chinese homeland or the survival of the CCP regime, because that's what could trigger Chinese nuclear use. This even creates risks for advanced U.S. conventional warfighting concepts. Take JMGC, for example, the Joint Concept for Access and Maneuver in the Global Commons. It used to be called Air-Sea Battle.
Right. Can you just briefly explain what JMGC is about and why it carries some nuclear risk, even though it's conventional?
Sure. JMGC is basically a blueprint for how the U.S. military would fight its way through China's A2AD network. It involves highly coordinated attacks across all domains, air, sea, space, cyber, to disrupt and destroy key Chinese military capabilities. Things like their command and control networks, missile launchers, air defenses, naval bases. The inherent danger is that some of those conventional targets the U.S. would need to hit also play a role in supporting China's nuclear forces. For example, command centers or early warning radars might have both conventional and nuclear roles. So the big fear is misinterpretation. Beijing might see these widespread conventional attacks, especially early in a conflict, as the opening moves of a U.S. attempt to disarm China's nuclear deterrent, a preemptive counterforce strike. If they believe that, they might feel pressured into a use-it-or-lose-it situation with their own nuclear weapons, potentially launching them quickly before they could be destroyed. It means the U.S. has to be incredibly careful in designing and executing any conventional campaign to avoid signaling any intent to threaten China's strategic deterrent. Communication and de-escalation channels would be absolutely critical.
We've covered all the rational calculations, the strategic logic, the norms. But in the heat of a real crisis, isn't there always the wild card factor of just raw human emotion? Politics, public pressure.
That's the ultimate unknown, isn't it? The fog of war and the fog of crisis. All this careful, rational, strategic analysis about escalation control and the nuclear taboo. It could potentially be swept away by overwhelming political pressure and public outrage. Imagine if North Korea did manage to launch a successful large-scale attack, maybe a devastating conventional artillery barrage on Seoul, or a chemical attack, or even a limited nuclear strike causing mass casualties, tens or hundreds of thousands of deaths. The sheer horror and anger in the United States, the demands from the public and politicians to do something, to retaliate massively, that emotional wave could be immense. Think about the political atmosphere after 9/11, but potentially much, much worse. In that kind of superheated environment, could a U.S. president resist the pressure to retaliate with nuclear weapons, even if their strategic advisors were warning about the risks of escalation? It's impossible to know for sure. Emotion could potentially override logic. That's the frightening wild card.
So we come back then to where we started, this constant inherent tension at the very core of extended deterrence. You've got, on the one hand, Thomas Schelling's idea of the necessary ambiguity, the threat that leaves something to chance needing to be scary. But on the other hand, you have what the former British Defense Secretary Dennis Healey famously quipped, that maybe it only takes 5% credibility to deter an enemy, but you need 95% credibility to reassure an ally.
That's it, exactly. And bridging that gap, that credibility gap between the 5% needed to deter and the 95% needed to reassure, that's why the U.S. is constantly engaged in this process of visible reassurance. The dialogues like EDD and DSC, the rotational bomber flights, the joint military exercises, it's all designed to pump up that reassurance level closer to 95%. The raw capability is unquestioned. But the credibility of resolve is always under scrutiny, always needs tending, precisely because everyone understands that the actual use of a nuclear weapon is just so strategically catastrophic, morally fraught, and politically toxic.
But there's a really powerful underlying reason why the U.S. works so hard to maintain that credibility, isn't there? It goes beyond just defending Tokyo and Seoul from attack.
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental to U.S. global strategy. The U.S. nuclear umbrella is arguably the single most effective non-proliferation tool the United States possesses, especially in Asia. Why? Because it works, for the most part, in convincing highly capable allies like Japan and South Korea countries that absolutely could develop their own nuclear weapons if they chose to, that they don't need to. They can rely on the U.S. guarantee instead. If that U.S. commitment were ever seen to definitively fail, if decoupling became perceived reality, the pressure within Japan and South Korea to develop their own independent nuclear deterrence would likely become immense, maybe irresistible, and that would shatter the non-proliferation regime in Asia and fundamentally change the entire strategic landscape, almost certainly for the worse.
So, given everything we've discussed, the relentless military modernization by China, the persistent instability and nuclear advancement from North Korea, the final question really is for you, the listener, to think about. Can the United States continue to walk this incredibly fine line? Can it maintain a nuclear posture that is simultaneously terrifying enough to deter these very capable adversaries, yet still credible and reassuring enough to keep its own advanced, technologically sophisticated allies from deciding they need to build the bomb themselves? Especially when political support for these very alliances sometimes seems uncertain back home. That's the tightrope Washington has to walk day in and day out.